Hey Chevra, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101 of Masechta Ayruvin. Today we talk about some kind of very Ayruvin-y kind of inyanim, like can you put a door in a doorway can you affix a door to a doorway on Shabbos, and locking, bringing keys into locks, and from Carmelitism, Rosh Hashanah, and all that kind of stuff. We'll get to the machlokas between Rav Meir and the Chachamim about standing in Rosh Yachid and locking things in Rosh Hashanah, things like that. Chevra, let's get started. Daf Kuf Aleph, Amud Aleph, all the way at the top. New Mishnah. Delis shebe muktzeh. So a muktzeh is like a shed area. It's like an area behind the house where you just kind of like store things. So if you have the door of the muktzeh, v'chadakim shebe pirza, or if you have like branches and things that you stuffed into like thorns and stuff that you stuff into a breach in a wall to close it up, machzalos and mats, einal and bayan, ela imken gvoim min art. So you're not allowed to use them to close the space unless it's elevated from the ground. Meaning if it's just like on the ground, you're going to take it and stuff it into the space, well then it's like bone. It's like you're adding onto the building. But if it's suspended from the ground, well then you'd be allowed to push it in place. V'raminu, says the Gemara, we have a contradiction. Delas nigreres, if you have a door that you schlep on the ground, machzelas nigreres, or if you have a mat that you schlep on the ground, v'kan kana nigrar, or if you have a handles of a plow that you schlep on the floor. Bizmanchik shurin v'tzluyin noalin bain b'Shabbos. So if they are tied, and also if they are tied to the door, or if they are hanging from the top of the door but touching the ground, but just connected from the top, so then noalin bain b'Shabbos, you'd be allowed to put them in place and close the door on Shabbos. And certainly if you do it on Shabbos, you can do it on Yom Tov. But we don't see that they actually have to be elevated from the ground. So Amar Abaye b'sheyesh laim tzir. So Abaye says that it's talking about, well, they might not be elevated from the ground, but they have some kind of a pivot that they are, i.e. they're like connected to the wall, and there's some kind of pivot that you can swing it on. Rava Amar b'shahaya laim tzir. Rava says even if they don't currently have a pivot that you swing it on to close the door, but at one point they had it, i.e. it's clear that this was once a door, so then it wouldn't be considered like bona, and that would be acceptable. Maybe we have a kasha. Delas anigreris, machzelas anigreris. If you have a door that you schlep on the ground, or a mat that you schlep on the ground, v'kankan anigrar, or a handle to a plow that you schlep on the ground, that you drag on the ground, bizman shekshurin v'tzluyin v'gavoim min haaretz, afilu milonima. So if they are tied or hanging, and they are above the ground, even if it's just a hair's breadth above the ground, no'al and bayan, then you can close them. Then you can put it in the gap in the wall and use it to close the wall. Ve'imla, but if they're on the ground, ein no'al and bayan, so then you would be unable to use them to close the door. So on the one hand, Abaye and Rava said that they don't actually have to be elevated from the ground as long as they have like a pivot. Whereas over here, we're saying that they have to actually be elevated from the ground. So Abaye mitaritz the time, Rava mitaritz the time. So both Abaye and Rava answer this question. Abaye mitaritz the time, o sheish lain tzir, o shegvo min haaretz. So Abaye says, look, either they have to have a pivot or they have to be elevated from the ground, right? So if you have this, like, I don't know, let's say door, and it's like tied, let's say, to the top of the door post, right? And there's like a rope that it's hanging from. So if it's touching the ground, well then it's going to have a pivot. And if it's not touching the ground, well then that would be fine. It doesn't need the pivot. Rava mitaritz the time, shahayla and sir. Rava says, well, either if it had at one point a pivot, or if it's elevated from the ground. If either of those two conditions are met, well then you'd be able to close the door with it. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, soche kotzim v'chavilin shetiknon v'pirza shebachatzer. So these thorns and bundles of sticks that you put it into a breach in a chatzar, bisman shekshurin v'tzluyin no'alim b'hem b'Shabbos, if they are tied, and in this case it means also hanging above ground, dangling from the ground, so no'alim b'hem b'Shabbos, so then you would be able to close the breach with it on Shabbos. Ve'in tzarich lom b'yom tov, and certainly on Yom Tov. Tani Reb Chia taught, deles almana, if you have a door that is an almana, that is a widow, and we're going to define what that means in a minute. Hanigreres, that drags on the floor, ein no'alim ba, you would not be allowed to close a breach with it. Heichidami, heichidami delas almana, what is this widow door that you're not allowed to close a breach with? Ikadami dechatshifa vikadami delas deles le gishma. So some say it's talking about that it's just one board. It's just a board of wood. So clearly that's not clear, but it doesn't look like a door. so therefore it looks like bona that you're adding onto a building. Or the other way to look at it is that it's two pieces, but they don't have like a cross beam that's like connecting the two pieces together properly. So in those cases, it doesn't look like it's a door that you're fastening in place, and therefore it would look like bona and it would not be allowed. Review this is review the high madurta. If you're putting together a like bonfire and you're taking all these like pieces of wood and you're stacking them up one on the other. So mimayla lamata shari. So you'd be allowed to. It's kind of interesting, but you'd be allowed to like hold the top layer. Let's just go back there a second. You wouldn't be able to construct it the normal way, which is basically to stack it up from the bottom. So let's say you wanted to like make a square of these logs and then make another square on top of it, and the middle is like hollow, and then you want to take other logs and lie them across the top and add like a roof. That would not be allowed. But if you kind of put the roof in place and like hold it in place, and then from the floor you build up to where you're holding the roof of this bonfire, so then that would be acceptable. The same thing with an egg. If you want to like put an egg on a grill, don't like put an egg directly on a grill, rather like have the eggs there and then build the grill underneath it to where the eggs are. Kidra, also the same thing with a pot. Don't put it on like a setting, rather like hold the pot and then put its setting underneath it. Purya, also a bed. If you're constructing a bed, don't build the legs and then put the bed on top of it, rather hold the bed and then put the legs underneath it. Chavisa, and also a barrel. If you want to put a barrel on top of other barrels, right, again, hold it in place and then put the other barrels underneath it. Amaliyahu mina Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, of certain min, said to Rabbi Yoshua, Chadka, you thorny person, tichsiv b'chu, that it says about you, tovam kechedek, that the good people of Israel are like thorns. Amalei Shatya, Rabbi Yoshua said to him, you fool, shvil sefer dikra. Go look at the end of that very pasuk. Tichsev, the pasuk says, Yashrim imisocha, that the straight people are like a sukkah, that they're strong, they're with their protection. Ve'elamai tovim kechedek. Then what does it mean that the good ones are like thorns? So kshem shechadakim alalu maginin ala pirza, just like thorns protect when you put them in a breach. Kach tovim she Banu, also the good among us, among Israel, Meginim Aleinu, they protect upon us. Another way to understand it, Tovim Kechedek, that the good ones are like a thorn, Shemahadkin Esarishayim the Gehenim, that they grind up the evil people to Gehenim. Shnemar, as the pasuk says, Kumi Vadoshi Vas Tzion, get up and thresh and grind up the daughter of Tzion. Kikarnech Asim Barzel, I will make your horns like iron, ufarsosayich asim nechusha, and I will make your hooves the nechoshes. Nechoshes is what? It's copper, I think. V'hadekos amim v'hadikosa amim rabim v'gomer, and you will v'hadikos amim rabim, and you will like grind up all of these nations. Very beautiful. Says the Mishnah, a person shouldn't stand in Rishus HaYachid and then open up a lock that's in Rishus HaRabim. Okay? Rishus HaRabim yiftach Rishus HaYachid. You shouldn't stand in Rishus HaRabim and open up a lock that's in Rishus HaYachid. Unless he built a wall around him, meaning if he's standing in Rishus HaRabim, then he shouldn't open up a lock that's in Rishus HaYachid. But if he builds like a Rishus HaYachid around him and now he's standing in Rishus HaYachid, well then it's fine. Alright? That's Rav Meir's opinion. Amrulo, they said to Rav Meir, Ma'aseh b'shuk shel tamim. There was a story with a shuk of butchers, Shaya b'Yerushalayim, that was in Jerusalem. That they would lock up their doors and then leave the key on a window that was on top of the entranceway. Right, and the assumption is that the lock was a Rishus HaYachid, and they're putting it on the window that was above the entranceway. We're actually going to see a brisa that's going to talk about this a little bit. So they said that basically they were allowed to stand in seemingly what was a Rishus HaRabim and lock this door. And we're going to get to a brisa which talks more about these locks and these windows and what that is. Rabbi Yossi Omer Shuk Shel Tzamarim Haya. Rabbi Yossi says that this wasn't a butcher's market. This was a wool dealer's market. Says the Gemara, V'Rabbanan, I don't understand the opinion of the rabbis. Amar Reb Meir, Rishus HaRabim, Hadru Inu Karmelis. Reb Meir is talking about Rishus HaRabim. He says that you shouldn't stand in Rishus HaRabim and then lock a door that's in Rishus HaYachid. or even the lock is Rishus HaYachid. Again, we're going to get to a brisa which talks about this, what these locks are in just a few minutes. But basically, according to Meir, he's standing in Rishus HaRabim, and the Chachamim are responding about a Carmelist. What do you mean that they're responding about a Carmelist? Well, because they're talking about Jerusalem. That Rabbi Bachana says in Rabbi Yochanan that when it comes to Jerusalem, that if not for the fact that its gates are locked at night, well then it would be a Rishus HaRabim, meaning, to make it in the positive versus the negative, because we lock the gates of Jerusalem are locked at night, therefore it is not a Rishus HaRabim, therefore it is a Carmelist. So basically, Rabbi Meir is saying don't stand in a Rishus HaRabim and lock in a Rishus HaYachid, and they're responding about something that happened in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is a Carmelist because it has gates. So Amar Rav Papa kan kodem shenifritzu bapratzos kan la'achar shenifritzu bapratzos. So Rav Papa says, well, that was true, that it was a Carmelist when there were no breaches in the wall. But once there were breaches in the wall, well then it's no longer a Carmelist, and it's a Rishus HaRabim, and that's why it's a good response to Reb Meir, and they're both talking about Rishus HaRabim. Rava Amar Seif Asan l'shar egina. So Rava says actually the Seifa, the Chacham are responding to what Reb Meir said about gates of gardens, that a garden being a Carmelist because it's larger than a Beis Sa'asayim, and it's lo kaf ledira, so it's a karpaf, and you're not allowed to carry more than Daled Amas. So that is what they're talking about. And this is what's going on. You shouldn't stand in a Rishus HaYachid and open up a lock that's in a Carmelist. But Carmelist v'yiftach b'Rishus HaYachid, you shouldn't stand in a Carmelist and open a lock that's in Rishus HaYachid. Elim ken asam mechitza gavoa asar tfachim divrei Meir. Unless he made a wall that's 10 tfachim tall around him in the Carmelist, well then he'll essentially be in a Rishus HaYachid, and then he can open up the lock. Amrulo, they said to which Chacham said to Rabbi Meir, wait, why are you saying that you're not allowed to stand in a Carmelist and open a lock in Rishus HaYachid? There's a story about the butchers, the meat market in Jerusalem, that they would lock the doors, and they were in Jerusalem, which is a Carmelist, and they would lock the lock and then put them up the key in a window that was above the door. So Rabbi Yossi Omer Shuk Shel Tzamarim Haya, Rabbi Yossi says actually it was a market of wool sellers, not a market of butchers. Okay, but the way that Rav understands it, basically it's a discussion about Carmelists. Rav Meir is saying don't stand in a Carmelist and lock a lock in Rishus HaYachid, to which the Chacham say, what do you mean? But in Jerusalem, which was a Carmelist, they would stand there and lock these locks. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Pischei Share Gina, these gates to these gardens. So now remember, the garden is a Carmelist. So Bizman sheyesh lo'en beis sha'ar mi bifnim posech v'noa mi bifnim. So if on the inner side of the door there is actually like a gatehouse around the door, well then you could stand inside that gatehouse on the inside and open up the door because you're standing in a Rishus HaYachid. So mi bachutz posech v'noel mi bachutz. And if this gatehouse is on the outside, well then you'll be able to open up the door from this gatehouse that's on the outside. Mikan posech v'noel Khan v'chan. If the gatehouse is on either side of the door, well then you can stand in either gatehouse and open this door. And we're gonna see soon that according to Reb Meir, this lock itself is a Rishus HaYachid, right? So therefore, by making a gatehouse around the lock, which is a Rishus HaYachid, and you're standing in Rishus HaYachid, well then you can open up this lock. Now if there's no gatehouse on either side of the door to this garden, which is a Carmelist, well then you cannot open the lock at all. And similarly, stores that are open to Rishus HaRabim. Well, if the lock is below 10 tfachim, well then it's a Carmelist, right? Because the assumption is that it's a 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, this lock, and therefore it's Rishus, well, if it's above 10 tfachim, it's Rishus HaYachid. If it's below 10 tfachim, it's a Carmelist. So maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos menichu be'iskopa. So you could bring a key from Erev Shabbos and leave it on the threshold. Now the threshold being a Carmelist. The assumption is that the threshold is also a Carmelist. So l'macho posech v'noel. So then tomorrow, he's got this key on the Carmelist. I don't understand what good a key is for a lock if you're just going to leave it there, but akopanim. So then the next day he can come and take the key from the Carmelist and he can open up he could stand on the carmelis and then open up this lock, which is within 10 tefachim, which is also a carmelis. And then he could put the key back on the carmelis, and everything happened in a carmelis. Now, if the lock is above 10 tefachim, i.e., it's a reshus hayachid, maybe maftech me'erev Shabbos, so he could bring a key from before Shabbos, and he leaves it on top of the lock, which is a reshus hayachid, and then the next day he could take the key from on top of the lock, open the lock with it, and then put it back on top of the lock, and that's Rav Meir's opinion. Now you might be thinking, wait, but he's going to be standing in either a reshus harabim or a carmelis, and then he's going to be opening the lock, which is a reshus hayachid. I thought he's not allowed to. So the Gemara is going to ask that question a little bit later. The Chacham say, even if the lock is above 10 tefachim, maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos, he can bring a key from before Shabbos, and he can leave it on the threshold, which is a carmelis, and then the next day he can open up this lock, and he can lock the lock and bring it back to the carmelis, or he can put it on the window that is on top of the door. However, if the window above the door is 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, i.e. it's a reshus hayachid, then it would not be allowed, because then you're carrying from a reshus from an iskopa into a reshus hayachid. But if it's less than 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, it's a makom ptur, and then you're allowed to put the key from the iskopa, which is a carmelis, into this makom ptur. Now you might be thinking, wait, how could they take the key from the carmelis and put it in the lock, which is a reshus hayachid? We'll get there in a minute. Now, now, from the fact that we said, and similarly stores, meaning we were talking about this garden, which is a carmelis, and we said similarly stores, well, it must be that this threshold that we're talking about is a carmelis as well. Now, what's the deal with this lock? Like, we're talking about locks being reshus hayachids, like, what's the deal? If it's not 4 tefachim, well then makom ptur. Well, then it's a makom ptur, and what's Reb Meir's problem with when it is above 10 tefachim, right? Meaning he said that if the lock is within 10 tefachim, so then he could take the key from the carmelis, put it in the lock, which is also a carmelis, and that's fine. But if it's above 10 tefachim, so then he said all of a sudden you can't take it from the carmelis anymore. But if it's less than 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, well then it's a makom ptur. So what's his problem? So is be'arba, and if it has 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, well then b'halem rabbanon habizman shamanu l'mayla miyud. But then in this case, would the rabbi say that even if the lock is above 10 tefachim and it's 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, i.e. it's reshus hayachid, maybe maftech me'erev Shabbos, that he could still bring a key from erev Shabbos umanicho be'iskopa and leave it on the iskopa, which is a carmelis, and l'macho poseach v'noabo umachzur le'iskopa, and then tomorrow he can take a key and open and use it in the lock and then put it back in the carmelis, or l'cholon shagabi pesach, or in the window on top of the door. But he's carrying from a carmelis to reshus hayachid, right? If we say that the lock itself is 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, i.e. it's a reshus hayachid, well then how could the rabbi say that you could take the key from the carmelis, the scopa, which is a carmelis, and use it to open the lock, which is a reshus hayachid? And that's taking something from one reshus to another reshus. So what's the deal? I don't understand. If it's not 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, so it's a makom ptur. So what's Reb Meir's problem with taking the key from the carmelis and using it to open this lock, which is a makom ptur? And if it is 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, how could the chacham say that you're allowed to use the key from the carmelis and use it to open the lock? So Amar Abai says le'olam de'ein bo arba. So really it's talking about a lock that is not 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. V'yesh bo lachuk u'lashlimo l'dalet. However, theoretically, right, so let's say the lock is 2 tefachim deep, but the door is, let's say, 3 tefachim deep. And so theoretically you can etch into the door another 2 tefachim, and in which case you would be able, the lock would now be 4 tefachim deep. And since you could potentially etch out this area, Rabbi Meir says that we treat it as if it's etched out, right? These are the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chacham. Rabbi Meir says Rabbanon sabi ein chokin lahashlim. Rabbi Meir says, look, that we etch out into the door to complete to fill in the 4 tefachim of the lock to make it Rosh Hashanah, and therefore you're not allowed to use the key from the Carmelis and put it into the lock, which is we'll treat it as a Rosh Hashanah. Whereas the Chachamim don't say chokakin la'ashlim, and therefore it would be only 2 tefachim in our example, and therefore it would be a makom ptur. Therefore you'd be allowed to take the key from the iskopa and put it into the lock, which is a makom ptur. Amar Beva bar Abaye, Shma minam meha masnisa tlas. So we learned 3 things from this brisa. Shma mina chokakin lahashlim. So we learned that chokakin lahashlim. I guess the assumption being that we're holding like Reb Meir here, and we're saying chokakin lahashlim that you etch out into the door to fill it out. Shma mina hadaber Reb Meir. And we also see that Reb Meir clearly retracted on his opinion, right? Up until now, it's even been coming up really for the past few days, that Reb Meir's opinion was always that you'd be unable to be standing in Rosh Rabim and open a lock in Rosh Hashanah. Yet, meaning if the lock is in Rosh Hashanah and the key is in Rosh Hashanah, you would be unable to be standing in Rosh Rabim and be facilitating things going on in Rosh Hashanah. However, he said that you would be allowed to stand on the iskopa, which is a Carmelis, and take the key from Rosh Hashanah and open the lock, which is in Rosh Hashanah, even though he's standing in a Carmelis. So we see that he retracted what he initially said. Vishmas Minam, we also learn Midrabanan Isa the Rav Dimi. We also heard from the rabbis that we hold of Rav Dimi. Let's go weiter for a second. As we've seen a few times, the Chiyasa Rav Dimi, that when Rav Dimi came, Rav Yochanan said the name of Rav Yochanan, Makom she'ein bo arba al arba, that if you have a place that is less than 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, i.e. it's a makom ptur, mutu livnei Rosh Hashanah, livnei Rosh Hashanah lechatif alav. So the people in Rosh Hashanah and the people in Rosh Hashanah are able to put their loads on this makom ptur. They just can't use it as a hack, as a loophole, to take something from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah from via the makom ptur and vice versa. And we see that the Chacham said that you're allowed to take the key from the threshold, which is a Carmelis, and use it to open this key, and then and the lock is a makom ptur, and he says that you could then afterwards put it above the doorway, on the window above the doorway, only if the window above the area above the doorway is less than 4 tefachim. They said if it was 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, you'd be unable to put this key there. Now, what should be the problem? You're taking something from a Carmelis, you're then putting it in the lock, which is a makom ptur, and then from the makom ptur, you're transferring it to this, even if the place above the door is 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, it's Rosh Hashanah, but you're transferring from a makom ptur to Rosh Hashanah. So we see from the fact that the Rabbanan say you're not allowed to do it, that it must be that we hold of Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who said that while you're allowed to put things from either Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah onto Makom Ptur, you can't use it as a loophole to transfer things from one Rosh to another Rosh. That was the Kuf Aleph of Masechta Ayruvin. The first part of the daf really just talked about using these doors and stuff, doors that are kind of not attached properly to houses. Can you stuff them into the doorway? Abaye said you can if it either has a pivot on it or if it's dangling from the ground, extended above the ground. And Rava says either if it once had a pivot on it or if it's extended above the ground. Then we got into this other Mishnah about machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about can you be standing in one rishus and open up a lock in the other, and ultimately Rabbi Meir seems to be saying that yes, you can. And we also see at the end that we paskin like that we hold of Rav Dimi that you're not allowed to transfer one thing from one rishus to another rishus by way of a makom ptur. Peace out.